Well, hello. Welcome to our webinar. This is the third in our series, Mind Over Muscle. Really looking forward to this. Got a great team of people working on this. You've got Master Cycling Coach Pav helping out here. Some of you know him from his infamous interval workouts on Human Go. And Therese Hammerschmidt, who's here as well, exercise physiologist with Human Powered Health. So are we going to give it a couple of minutes to let people drift in? Is that our idea? They'll be fielding questions in the chat, and we'll have a nice opportunity to answer your questions at the end. So if you have any, make sure that you send them in, and we'll get started once we give people just another moment or two to get connected and get in here. So really looking forward to this conversation today. I think it's a nice one to kind of build on the other two webinars that we've been doing in this series. We're going to spend some time talking about getting to understand a little bit more about how our brain works and how we can use that understanding to kind of better leverage consistency in our training. And we'll talk about how we build up momentum and consistency in training over time, and how we keep that momentum going when the inevitable setbacks happen, or as we're saying in our title here, when things go sideways. Some of you will know who I am from our prior webinars. Some of you won't. My name is Scott Frey. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training, and I spent the last 30 years of my life running laboratories and brain imaging research centers in a number of universities around the US. And my research interest has always been focused on how we can get a better understanding of the mechanisms in the brain that contribute to performance in a general sense. And so about a year and a half ago, I decided it was time for a change, and I went off on my own with a real interest in seeing how we could connect some of that science to athletic performance in the real world. And I started a little business, Cerebral Performance, and through Cerebral Performance, I'm working with a variety of athletes, some elite, some not so elite, who are all unified in the goal of trying to put science to work to find out more about what their potential and boundaries are in their athletic performances. So moving from the lab to the real world has been my own personal transition, and it's an ongoing one, learning as I go. So I guess we could probably get started now. Does that sound good? Everybody ready? All right. So this is a joint production by Human Powered Health and Human Go. So I feel very lucky to have their support and backing in this. And without further ado, I guess we'll just get into things. So as I mentioned at the onset, there's a team of people here. I get to be the center stage, but Pav Bryan, master cycling coach at Human Go, and Therese Hammerschmidt, performance director at Human Powered Health, are a big part of what you're seeing here today, as well as Jemima Cooper. So I want to thank them right up front for their contributions, and we'll get started. There's a lot of talk these days in endurance athletics about the Norwegian method. And I'm not going to say a thing about the Norwegian method. Probably some of you know a lot about that already. But I'm going to give you a little story about an athlete from Norway who's quite remarkable, and I think provides a very interesting opportunity to get into our topic today about maintaining momentum when things go sideways. So Astrid Slind is currently one of the very best cross-country ski racers in the world. In fact, she just won the prestigious Tour de Ski, which, if you're not a cross-country ski racing aficionado, you can think of it as like a week-long series of races, all different disciplines, all different distances. And Astrid took home the gold from that. So very impressive accomplishment, a real pinnacle in world top level cross country ski racing. And she's currently leading the cross country ski racing cup in the distance events at age 37. That's the really remarkable thing here. And her story is, here's somebody in one of the most demanding aerobic endurance sports in the world. And she's closing in on 40 years of age. She had great success as a junior at the international level, but then she really struggled to make Norway's A team. Norway is an incredibly deep country in terms of its cross-country skiers and in other endurance disciplines as well. But Astrid hadn't really made her way onto Norway's World Cup A team in her prime years. And so she, rather than getting discouraged, leaving the sport, she persisted in her training. She persisted in her racing, but did it through racing these kind of large series of international ski marathons, and then circled back around in her mid to late 30s, got on Norway's A team, and is just really doing some impressive things there. And so we can ask, how is this possible? I'm going to show you some data in a minute that suggests that the answer is probably not physiological in the sense that we normally think of it, but it's really probably has a lot to do with what's going on from the neck up. I couldn't really justify my existence as a scientist without having some data to show you. And so if we ask how somebody like Astrid is making such a headway in athletics at a later than normal age, and if you think about what's required for that, one of the key things is being able to build and maintain momentum in training over long periods of time. Now, we could talk about a lot of different ways of measuring the effectiveness of one's training for endurance athletes, but of course, one of the classic ways is to look at maximal aerobic power, or VO2 max. And what we know about your VO2 max is that it begins to decline pretty early. And you can find different estimates of this in the scientific literature, and Therese and Pav could probably give you a much better explanation than a cognitive neuroscientist could for why that's happening and when that's happening. But let's just say that VO2 max begins to decline around age 30. One of the things that we know is that these age-related physiological changes that take place pretty early in our lifespan really can be considerably slowed down when we are consistent in our training. And I think that that's a really key point for all of us, right? We're all out here trying to do our best over years and decades, and in sustaining this high level of performance. And the data bears out the fact that if you keep training consistently, you can dramatically slow those normal age-related changes. And what I've got here illustrated in this graph here is kind of a meta-analysis of half a dozen studies that have looked at changes in VO2 max in their relationship to training volume in masters athletes and athletes over the age of 30 years. And there's half a dozen studies contributing here to these data points. But the basic idea is that as your training volume changes, which is what's represented on the horizontal axis going from left to right here, when your training volume drops off here on the left, so too do we see big dips in VO2 max. And if you can maintain that training consistency, those dips are greatly slowed down. So the key here is that if you're going to get the best out of yourself and maintain your performance as you age, and again, we're not talking older people necessarily, but we're talking any of us who are beyond the age of 30, consistency is key. And I chose to just show this data from VO2 max, but we could have chosen any number of other physiological variables to illustrate the point that age-related physiological declines are considerably slowed by maintaining your momentum, consistent training. And changes in that training, right, decreases in that training are the biggest predictors of how much your VO2 max is going to be affected by age. Now, rule number one, therefore, if you want to maintain a high level of performance over time, is you need to build and maintain your momentum. Rule number two is that when inevitably things go sideways and challenge that momentum, you need to get yourself back on track. You need to regain momentum when things go sideways. So continuing along using VO2 max as an illustration, VO2 max is really sensitive to the duration of any breaks in training, time off, training cessation. So you can see that there are changes in our VO2 max that are pretty linear with the number of days of training cessation. Very difficult to do these studies because endurance athletes like us, we hate taking time off, right? But there have been a small number of studies that have been able to look at that, and it's very predictable, right? If you take off 20 days, 40 days, 60 days, and so on, you're going to find a nice linear or not so nice linear fall off on your ability in your maximal aerobic power, your VO2 max. Now, the good news is that whether you're young or whether you're old, if you reestablish that training, those gains will come back, right? As you do whatever you need to do to regain your momentum, maybe overcoming an illness or getting through some difficult life challenges in work or relationships that derail your training, overcoming an injury. As you get back in motion, as you regain that momentum, that physiology is going to be there for you. Whether you're old or whether you're young, you're going to get recovery of the VO2 max. So we want to be mindful of rule number one, build and maintain that momentum, but we also want to be realistic. Things are going to go sideways. When we're talking about building fitness over weeks, months, years, there are going to be interruptions and there are going to be periods when we're not able to train in the way we'd like to. And the key there, rule number two, is regaining your momentum. And so when we see these amazing athletes like Astrid Slind, who have this long-term progress and development, you can bet that the two keys to that are building, maintaining, and then finally regaining momentum. So I guess three keys to that. All right. So that's all the physiology that this cognitive neuroscientist is going to talk about today. I'm now going to talk a little bit about why I think that building, maintaining, and regaining momentum are really issues that pertain to your fitness from the neck up. I think a very good argument can be made that the brain is the key to being someone who can maintain that momentum over long periods of time in both our training and in our competition. And that an investment in developing the mental skills that are critical to that kind of momentum building and conservation really grow in value as we age. These mental skills, while we see changes in physiology, in things like maximal aerobic power, uh, in an age-related sense, these kind of mental skills that I'm talking about, they're largely unaffected by age. And as a consequence of that, if we take the time to invest and develop in them, they can at least partially offset some of those changes in physiology. So if you're willing to invest in developing the sort of mental skills that you need to build, maintain, and regain your momentum when things go sideways, that can really help you to optimize your physiology and keep you on track over long periods of time and aid in your development. And as you get older and inevitable changes, no matter how consistent you are, there are going to be changes in your physiology. You can slow them with training, but you can't stop them. But what you can do, and what becomes more and more important, is the brain side of things. It has a potential to play an even greater role in the performance equation after our prime. And so, I'm about to turn 60 years of age next week, still racing skis, cross-country skis, and bicycles and things. Probably most of you who are here in the webinar, a great many of you, are over 30 years of age. And I'm really speaking to you. If you're under 30 years of age, you need to be thinking about these things too if you're looking at a program of long-term development. But for the athletes who are entering this master's phase of training and competition, the more you develop these mental skills, the more you can offset some of the age-related physiological declines that you're going to experience, no matter how consistent you are. So, what am I talking about? These mental skills. Well, the mental skills that I'm going to focus on today might be a little different than what you might normally think of. You might be thinking about confidence and imagery and mantras and things like that. And those things are all great and they're really important. But what I've chosen to focus on today is sort of a different take on things. And I hope you'll find it to be helpful and interesting. It's really to think about what are some of the common challenges that our brain creates when we think about fitness, our fitness, other people that we're competing against, and so on. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Here's a common assumption that I hear a lot. Athletes on the podium had flawless preparation and race execution. That reflects a kind of glitch in our thinking or a distortion in our thinking that psychologists would call a comparison bias. It's a tendency to overestimate other people's circumstances and situations relative to our own. Now, many of the coaches who are listening to this can likely vouch for this. Podiums are actually occupied by people who were best at creating, maintaining, and regaining momentum while navigating the inevitable obstacles that they experience during their training and during their competition. This idea of a flawless preparation where nothing went wrong, nobody got a cold or had some kind of setback, or the perfect race where everything just worked absolutely perfectly and there weren't challenges along the way, unexpected or expected, is largely a myth. The people who are best at solving the problem of realizing their success, whether it be standing on a podium or whether it be completing an event that they've really been hoping to do, or accomplishing something in their own training. They're the people who did the best job of navigating obstacles. And so we can ask, how, right? How do they do that? How do we look at highly accomplished athletes and see their success more realistically and learn from them the kind of lessons that we need to be better at managing our own momentum? And I'm going to suggest that one of the things that's critically important here in terms of a set of mental skills is understanding and managing momentum killers. Any of the athletes that you see achieving these remarkable successes, the Astrid Slins, they are people who are really good at managing momentum killers. So here's what I mean. If you want to become a master of momentum, you need to understand your brain's operating system. This is where I get to talk about a little bit of neuroscience. So back on my home turf a little bit here. I want you to think about this for a minute. We are constantly being bombarded with immense amounts of information. It's coming in from the external world through your senses. You're seeing and hearing and smelling and feeling all sorts of information. It's an immense amount. And it's also coming from inside of you. You're monitoring your internal state all the time. Our body has all these wonderful sensory systems that allow us to do this, but they're so good that they're capturing just immense amount of information. And if we tried to process all of it, we would melt down. It's just too much. So the brain has evolved a bunch of shortcuts, or in jargon, heuristics, to rapidly process the key bits, to find the key bits of information that we need in order to guide our behavior adaptively. So you can think of these shortcuts or heuristics as ways of just kind of quickly being able to sort through this immense amount of information that we're experiencing at any one moment and find the things that are critical to guiding our behavior adaptively. And the reason you're here now is because all of your ancestors have been successful at doing that. It's kind of an amazing thing to think about. The brain has incredible systems to get this done. But like any operating system, it's not perfect. So in fact, there are a number of glitches that psychologists have studied for many decades in our brain's operating system. And you can think of these glitches as the price we pay for the brain's shortcuts. So we evolved these shortcuts to deal with this problem of massive amounts of information, to find those kernels that we need to guide us adaptively in our behavior. But that comes at a price. And the price are these kind of glitches, which psychologists talk about in a different way. They use the term thought distortions. So I like to think of them as glitches, but they are in fact also momentum-killing thought distortions that can really sabotage our ability to create, maintain, and regain our momentum. And I want to share my podium of momentum-killing thought or cognitive distortions or glitches in the operating system of the brain with you, and talk a little bit about what these are, how they affect performance, and what we can do to try and overcome them. And I want to upfront just say, these are not peculiar to athletics. These are things that are part of our operating system and apply to all realms of behavior. So there's a real opportunity here to use athletics and the opportunity to practice dealing with and overcoming these distortions that we can also then bring back into the rest of our lives. And I think there's real value in that. So the first, and I'm going to dig into these deeper in a minute, is polarized thinking, having an all or nothing kind of mindset. And again, I'll say more about that shortly. The second is what we call the distortion of loss aversion. And that's basically fearing the costs of failure over the potential gains of success. And the final one is mind reading. And that is exactly what it sounds like. Assuming that we know how others are thinking and feeling. So let's take these one at a time. I want to begin my bit here on the gold medal winning polarized thinking distortion by presenting you with a little thought experiment. So imagine that you've got some of Coach Pav's intervals, and you start out and you're just not hitting your numbers, right? So you get the warm up done and you start that first interval. Maybe that one you hang on by your fingertips and you're able to get it done at the wattage, say that you were hoping for. But boy, it was a big struggle. And the next one you don't hit the numbers. What do you do? Or what do you do if you've got 30 minutes to work out because of the rest of the chaos that's going on in your life? And your session that you got from HumanGo is an hour long. How do you handle those situations? Do you adjust? Do you say, well, I'm not going to hit the power goal today, but I can hit a power that is, 10% less than what I was hoping for, or 20% less? Or do you quit? Or if you've only got that 30 minutes, do you take it and go for a run, even though that run was supposed to be an hour? Or do you bail out? I think the answer to that question is a really important one. There are definitely times when you should quit. Um, you're really coming down with something. You've got an injury that's flaring up. But I'm not talking about those times. I'm talking about those kind of experiences that all of us have when we're trying to follow a plan, when we're trying to create and build momentum, and things just aren't going as well as we hoped they would. As someone who works with athletes on the mental side of performance, I think it's really important that we figure out how to adjust and adapt, how to take that 30 minutes and make the most of it, how to dial back the wattage on those intervals and still get Coach Pav's workout done. Because that's what's going to contribute to our long-term progress and development as an athlete. That's what's going to contribute to our momentum. There's a problem, right? This polarized thinking is a kind of all or nothing thinking. I've got to hit the target workout power. I've got to have the full hour or it's not worth doing. And I think that kind of thought distortion, that all or nothing distortion, another way of looking at it is perfectionism. It's a kind of perfectionism, really is a momentum killer because it disrupts our consistency. If we start behaving in a way where it's got to be all or nothing, our momentum is going to constantly be disrupted. And that violates the first rule that I gave you, right? If you want to get on the podium, whatever that podium represents to you, literally the podium or any other goal that you might have as an athlete, then perfectionism is not going to help contribute to that. In fact, it may really kill your momentum. You've got to be able to get through the good times and the bad times and adjust as you go. So what can we do about this? I've told you that this is a glitch in our operating system and that, importantly, we're normally blind to these glitches, right? We usually are not so great at catching ourselves because, our operating system doesn't allow us to see that clearly and obviously the glitches in it. Well, the solution, as it is for all of these kinds of glitches, is figuring out ways to create an awareness, figuring out how to catch ourselves. And there are a bunch of different possible ways of doing that. Hopefully, listening to this talk, listening to this webinar is going to contribute to that in some way by letting you take a little bit of a look at your own behavior and identify whether you're falling into these kind of polarized thinking trap. Awareness. It's probably the single most important thing. And there are things we can do to help cultivate that awareness, like tracking our thought patterns, challenging those distortions by actually looking at the data, looking at the record, right? Is it true? And another way is involving someone else in our training. A coach is great for this, but it could be a training partner or a loved one or a friend. The idea is that we need to figure out how to bring this kind of pattern of thought to light, right? To get it out of our blind spot into our full view so that we can then deal with it and not suffer the effects on our momentum and training and racing. I'm going to give the silver medal to the loss aversion distortion. So, a little thought experiment to illustrate that. If I said to you right now, guess what? You're entering a race this weekend. Would you feel excited for, wow, I wonder how that'll go? Or would you immediately start feeling anxious and thinking up reasons why it was a really bad time for you to race? Haven't been training enough, not getting enough sleep, whatever it happens to be. I'm in the base phase and I haven't even done any speed work yet. Um, I think how people answer this question is an interesting one. There isn't really a right answer, but how you answer it is what's of interest to me. Um, because if you're falling into this kind of loss aversion glitch or thought distortion, you will overestimate the costs of failure. For example, wow, if I race now, I'll do really poorly because I've only been doing less training than I normally would. Or I haven't done the speed work that would prepare me for the rigors of competition. I'm just not ready. You might not be ready, but I would challenge you to ask, is it true? Are you overestimating the costs of failure? What would happen if you raced when you weren't ready? Maybe you learned something amazing, right? Um, are you avoiding risk? And if we can kind of take a more curious and open approach to challenges like an unexpected opportunity to enter a race when we're not in racing season, we might be surprised by the things that we discover. And if we can be open in that way and curious about our training, that's going to help to perpetuate our momentum. But to the extent that we start fearing what might happen if we don't live up to our expectations, right? How will other people think of us? Then that is very much a momentum killer. So I think the solution here is awareness, but it's also differentiating what's in our control and what's not in our control. And that's an incredibly important thing for us in life and as athletes. How could you reframe failure as an opportunity for learning? Maybe going into a race when you're not fully prepared and seeing what happens really is a chance for you to learn a lot, even though you're probably not going to do your best. And learning how not to do our best, learning how to not look at every race like it's got to be a high priority A race, is a real pro move. The professional athletes that I work with are really, really good at this. But the amateur athletes that I work with often struggle with it. So I want you to think about how you might respond to that challenge of the unexpected race. And are you falling into this kind of a loss aversion sort of thought distortion or not? And the final one, the bronze medal thought distortion, is mind reading. So the thought experiment for that is imagine that you're in a race or a training group, a competitive training group, and you're surrounded by other people. And let's say you're on your bicycle or you're running and you're really working hard. You're holding on to that group by your fingertips, right? Um, what do you think about the other people in that group around you? Do you think, wow, this is amazing. We're all suffering together. Or do you think, man, I think I'm the only one suffering here? It's a really common thing to look at the others in a group like that and think, boy, I'm hanging on for dear life here, and assuming they're doing much better than you are because you can't feel their pain. You can't experience directly what they're experiencing. You can see them, but it's also possible to really misinterpret what you're seeing, especially when you're breathing out of your ears. Psychologists talk about the illusion of superiority that when we're under pressure like that, we can fall into in competitive situations in particular, right? Where you think, man, I'm hanging on by my fingertips to this group or this competitor in a race, but they're feeling so much better than I am. Well, generally speaking, as I tell my athletes and as a coach told me many years ago, if those people are still next to you in that race or in that competitive training environment, they're probably suffering just as much as you are because if they felt better, they'd already have left you behind and been up the road. So I think it's good to be aware of the possibility that we have this tendency, it's kind of a glitch in our operating system to think we can really read other people's minds, that we know what they're thinking, we know how they're feeling. It's an illusion. If you find yourself thinking that everyone around you is superior when you're in these competitive environments, I challenge you to contemplate the possibility that this is just a glitch in your operating system, one of those cognitive or thought distortions. Question that assumption and be aware of the kind of biases that go along with it, the negativity, the kind of seeking of information that confirms your suspicions. Oh, look, that guy looks like he just smiled. He must feel great, whatever it happens to be. Um, this is another one of those momentum killers that I see commonly with a wide range of athletes, actually. And of course, as do all of the momentum killers, the polarized thinking, the loss aversion, and finally is mind reading, they're not peculiar to athletics. They're glitches in the operating system of the brain. We have one brain. We don't have an athletic brain and a work brain and a relationship brain and a parenting brain. It's all one brain. And to the extent that we can cultivate an awareness and confront these kind of momentum killers in our athletic life, that has real potential to transfer back into the rest of the life as well. And that's when things are really exciting. And that's when this kind of the beauty of athletics is really realized as it contributes to the quality of the rest of our lives as well. All right. So how do you get on the podium? How do you get on your podium? Whatever that happens to mean to you. Well, you build, maintain, and figure out how to regain momentum when things go sideways. You make your training consistent over time. And one of the key ways, as I've shared with you today, is to identify and challenge momentum killing thought distortions, those glitches in the brain's operating system that we all experience and that we are blind to under normal circumstances. You bring them into the light of full vision, you question them, and identify whether or not they are killing your momentum. Develop and lean on these kind of age-resilient mental skills or brain skills, and they'll serve you really well. But it takes work, just like any kind of training. And I guess the final concluding thought to share with you is that you need to expect your progress to be imperfect. It's going to be. We're not talking about something that is going to yield results in a day or in a week. The kind of progress we're talking about in these endurance sports is slow and gradual. And it takes this kind of consistent momentum. And the more that you can understand that that momentum is going to wax and wane and get yourself back on track when things go sideways, Learn from the obstacles you experience. See them as opportunities to learn and grow and develop as an athlete and as a person, the more successful you're going to be in all aspects of your life. So that's it. That's what I have for you for today. We're going to take questions, and I want to thank you on behalf of Human Go and Human Powered Health. And we will we'll leave it there. If you have questions, you can send them to either of the two email addresses here. So I guess what we're going to do now, Pav and Therese are working diligently in the chat room to field questions. We've got some things coming in. So I'm just going to take these one at a time. Thank you. Thank you all for your time. If you have to leave, I hope you'll stick around for some of these questions, often the most interesting part of these webinars. The first one, can you estimate how much you can offset physiological loss that comes with aging by doing the brain training? Boy, I wish I had an answer to that. I wish I could put a number on that. It's just really difficult to do. What I can say is that I will lean back on those first slides that I put up there, showing how important consistency is to offsetting age-related changes in VO2 max. And look, there are a lot of other systems we could have chosen to talk about. I picked VO2 max because it's something that most people are familiar with as kind of a metric of aerobic fitness or cardiovascular fitness. We could have picked a number of that other ones that I'm sure Pav and Therese could say so much about this to illustrate the point. But the point is that there is the extent to which we are consistent in our training, the extent to which we don't allow these momentum killers to disrupt our training over time is very predictive of the preservation or offsetting those age-related changes in variables like VO2 max. I wish I could put a very specific number on it, but I can't. So another one, in the middle of a workout, what might be a mental trick to understanding whether to adjust or to quit? Perhaps you can't hit the power because you're very fatigued. Yeah, this is a tricky one, right? Because what we don't want to be doing is telling people that, you just need to tough it out. You just need to push through. I've been an endurance athlete for over 40 years, and I've definitely made the mistake at times of pushing through when I should have gone home and gotten injured or gotten sick. One of the tricks that I've used myself and that I would recommend considering is the 20-minute rule or the 15-minute rule or the 10-minute rule. Head out the door and just make a bargain with yourself that you're going to see how you feel in 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it happens to be. And if you still feel like you can't do the workout at that point, then it's okay to bail. Dialing back, not getting into the kind of all or nothing or polarized thinking is a little different than that, right? If you can't hit the power, I would recommend, and Pav, and Therese, you may want to weigh in here, I don't know, but one thing that's worked for me is just adjusting the goal back by 10% and seeing if I can hit that number and how that might go. Probably if you have to adjust it another 10% back, then things might be indicating that you're really not going to benefit and you're digging a hole for yourself. That would be how I would approach it myself. But again, I'm not a coach. So if you guys want to weigh in on that and share some of the things you might suggest, that would be great. But I'm going to keep moving along with the questions. So here's another one. This is a good one. What are other tips and tricks to help retrain your brain to overcome perfectionism, whether it relates to time commitment, doing the workout, how it is written, or other aspects of training? Yeah, so the tricks all would involve cultivating some kind of awareness that that's what was going on, and catching ourselves. And so writing things down is a fantastic way of doing that, right? Looking at your training record or looking at notes you've kept in a journal that help you to really question whether it's true or not. That really bringing these all or nothing patterns of thought to light and challenging them with actual data, right? Is that actually what's happening? Or is this a distortion on my part? And I would say that that applies to the perfectionism, but that kind of thing applies more broadly to the other thought distortions as well. It can be really valuable to start writing things down and looking at them on a piece of paper. Sometimes we can be very surprised, right? When it goes from this kind of nebulous thought in our head that we might be actually adjusting our behavior to actually seeing it on paper. We could be like, wow, sometimes it's like, that's ridiculous. I can see that's ridiculous. Or speaking with somebody about it, telling them what you're thinking. Sometimes as it's coming out of your mouth, you'll catch yourself and realize that, wow, that's really distorted. That's just not true. So those are, this is not rocket science. And yet, because we're blind to these cognitive distortions by and large, it's a non-trivial thing to catch ourselves. And yet we can do it. And it will help us to keep that momentum going. So another question, it can be hard not to treat every race like an A race. Ha, oh boy, yeah, for sure, right? Because you want to put your best effort forward. For races that are scheduled as B or C races, do you have suggestions for how to make sure these races stay as B and C and are satisfied with the outcome? Yeah, that's so great. I love this question because I've had the opportunity, or I had the opportunity, to work with some very elite athletes, like Olympic level athletes, internationally successful athletes, and I've also had the opportunity to be not one of them, just a regular old amateur athlete, and to work with some pretty amazing amateur athletes, actually. And I will say that the pros are just so much better at keeping things in perspective, whether in what the investment is like when it's an A race that you've tapered and rested for, or whether it's a B race that might be kind of important and you want to do reasonably well, but you're maybe only going to rest a little bit for and not disrupt your training so much, or a C race that you're just going to train through. And I think one thing that helps in dealing with this, in my own experience as an athlete and is someone working with athletes who've had challenges with this at times, really getting clear on what your intentions are for the event, right? Being very clear, like what is a realistic intention for an A, B, or C race? Being very clear with that, writing it down, talking about it, sharing it with your coach, reminding yourself of it, having some kind of cue word or words that are very easy to remember during a race so that you keep to the plan. You stick to the plan and the intention. I just had a ski race last weekend, and my goal was that it was a C race. I wanted to stick to the plan. I was training through it. Boy, it's hard to keep that in perspective when you're standing on the start line and you're looking around and seeing your competition. You just want to go for it, right? But you have to realize you're not rested, and it's okay. So intentions are really important, and using keywords to keep them clear. I've gone as far as to have athletes write, things on where they can see them on a piece of tape, stick them to the stem of their bike, whatever works for you to remember those cues. Okay, another one. This is a great one. Beyond or in addition to heightened awareness of the thought glitches in an effort to avoid them, how might we actually embrace them to enhance training or performance, given their inevitable nature? How can we turn, I'll rephrase this. How can we turn obstacles into opportunities, right? How can we make them an advantage? What I really like about this question is that it shows an awareness of something really important, and it pertains to this glitch I was talking about earlier, where we might find ourselves thinking we're the only ones experiencing obstacles, right? That the people on the podium are the ones who had no obstacles, either in the training or the competition. That's nonsense. And I think one of the ways to turn and then realizing that we're all prone to those glitches, so that if you can master that glitch and be aware of it and not let it kill your momentum, man, you just got an advantage on your competition who isn't able to do that, whose momentum is getting killed by that podium of cognitive distortions or glitches when you're able to get to maintain your momentum through them. I think is a really important thing. So, how can you turn them to your advantage? Well, you can do some of the things we've talked about here today to recognize that these glitches are just part of how we're wired, and that knowing that and questioning your thought patterns and identifying the distortions when they happen, so that you don't have them in your blind spot and fall victim to them, turns them into an advantage, because your competition probably is tuned into those glitches and may in fact have their momentum being disrupted as a result of those thought distortions. So I think that's the key thing here, and that really hits the importance of what we're doing. All right, a couple of other things here. um, how to test when you're playing to lose or really needing to stop training. Let me think about that for a second. So, how to test when you're playing to lose. So, when I first am reading that, I'm thinking, wow, playing to lose, is that kind of like self-sabotage? So, you know, if you if you think about preparing for a race, it's really interesting the things that can sometimes happen to people where they actually sabotage their own performances unwittingly. And we could do a whole webinar on what that's about, but it really does grow out of a kind of another flavor of these thought distortions, right? People usually aren't aware that they're not doing these things, but if they could take a step back and objectively look at them, we often find that we fall victim to this kind of self-sabotage. And I would say that's a kind of playing to lose sort of thing, like not taking the time to, I don't know, check your tire pressure or optimize, some aspect of your equipment, or making sure that you have the tools you need if something goes wrong out there on the race course to deal with it. Not choosing, to have the extra pair of gloves when it might get cold, whatever it happens to be. It's almost this kind of coming out of this kind of fear of success in a certain way, where we're giving ourselves an out, an excuse. And a lot of times that's happening non-consciously. So starting to really check ourselves on that's a good thing. But I'm not sure that's what this question means in terms of playing to lose. Um, because it says, are you playing to lose or really are needing to stop training? I'm sorry, I just don't know about the second part, so I'm just going to skip ahead on that. Oh, playing to lose versus playing to win. Yeah, huh. So when we talk about loss aversion, are you overvaluing the costs of a failure relative to what you might benefit from success, whatever that success means? That would be, the sort of like silver medal thought distortion. Um, and I guess I'm still not quite following what you mean here in or what you're asking for an answer to that we haven't covered. So I think I'm going to jump ahead to a different question if you don't mind. Um, so this one, I chronically go above my recommended zones. Yeah, common, huh? And struggle to comprehend value in a zone two run. I live at altitude and my zone two feels so slow and not challenging. Yeah, I can relate to that. Can you recommend any strategies of how I might mentally overcome this during my workouts? Yeah, this is a huge one. I actually wrote an article, and if people want to see it, they can go to the website, but my website. But basically, why do we find it so hard to go easy? Is how I would put it. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that we get a lot bigger sense of accomplishment and reward from pushing. But obviously, pushing too often and not doing the kind of zone two base kind of work that should be kind of like the foundation of your training for most of our endurance sports um, is kind of grabbing a short-term benefit over a long-term gain. And I think overcoming that mentally is really figuring out how to reframe the value of those zone two workouts. Just because they don't feel hard doesn't mean that, and don't feel challenging, doesn't mean that they're not contributing to your long-term development, which is what all this is about, right? I mean, this whole webinar is about long-term momentum and consistency because we know that that's what produces the best endurance athletes. That's the basis for endurance sport, almost by definition. So I would say comprehending the value in your zone two work is requires you kind of reframing things a bit and realizing that this is an essential component to your development and really seeing the value in that. And realizing that if you don't do that work, you're never going to realize your potential. Yeah, interesting. So coming back around another question that relates well to the self-sabotage thing, right? So we could even frame that last question in that way. um, always pushing a little harder and not doing that foundational aerobic training that's going to build your mitochondria and make that engine bigger and more efficient. Um, Not doing that and just going for the quick reinforcing hit of pushing into your threshold, which feels oh so good. That this is probably one of the most common errors people make in training um, is a kind of self-sabotage, right? You're sabotaging your ability to really get the most out of yourself in the long haul. It's a short-term kind of gain that you're going to get from doing that work, and you're gonna end up going backward sooner than you think. So it's a kind of self-sabotage. So how do you feel about self-sabotage, pushing too hard in training, not recovering, etc., as a glitch? Yeah, I think those things are a kind of a glitch. And if you check out that piece that I wrote about I think it's titled something like "Why is it so hard to go easy?" I speculate a little bit about the nature of that glitch and why it might actually be a reflection of some systems that have to do with reward in our brain. Um, so check it out. There's a deeper answer there. All right. So here we are, right on time. Amazing. I want to thank you all for making time in your busy lives to spend an hour with me. It's a real privilege. If you want to learn more about my work, you can go to cerebralperformance.com. If you want to learn more about Human Go and human powered health, the websites or the email addresses are there. And you can explore all of the kind of content that's out from them. And I'll just thank you on behalf of Pav and Therese and Jemima for this opportunity. So have a wonderful week.